Western analysts obsess over missiles and military alliances in the Middle East. They track troop movements. They measure strike capabilities. They debate diplomatic outcomes. They miss the money. For 50 years, a single pattern has repeated with mechanical precision. Conflict erupts in the Middle East. Oil prices surge. Russia collects billions. The pattern is so consistent, so predictable, that Soviet planners in the 1970s built entire economic forecasts around it. The Soviet Foreign Trade Ministry maintained a classified index. They called it the Regional Instability Multiplier. Declassified Politburo memoranda from 1973 to 1991 reveal how Soviet leadership tracked Middle Eastern tensions the way commodities traders track weather patterns. They understood something Western observers consistently fail to grasp. Russia does not need to win wars in the Middle East. Russia needs the Middle East to remain unstable. The current Israel-Iran confrontation represents the largest activation of this pattern since the 2003 Iraq invasion. As American carrier groups position in the Eastern Mediterranean and Iranian proxies launch strikes across multiple fronts, oil markets respond with predictable anxiety. Brent crude fluctuates with each headline. Supply chain insurance premiums spike, and tankers carrying Russian crude steam toward Chinese and Indian ports at volumes that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. The numbers tell the story Western media ignores. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has tracked a 34% average increase in Russian oil revenues during each major Middle Eastern conflict since 1973. This is not coincidence. This is infrastructure. This is a system built over decades, refined through multiple crises, and now operating at peak efficiency. Welcome to Russia Historical. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. The petrodollar system that has anchored American financial dominance since 1974 now faces its most serious challenge. The Bank for International Settlements documents a dramatic shift in global oil payment mechanisms. Yuan settlements, rupee transactions, ruble exchanges. The dollar's monopoly on energy trade erodes with each passing month. You pay for this erosion every time you fill your gas tank. You fund it through inflation that central banks struggle to control. You absorb it through purchasing power that shrinks, while economists offer explanations that ignore the structural transfer of wealth happening in real time. The Israel-Iran conflict is not separate from your economic reality. It is the mechanism accelerating changes that will shape global finance for decades. This is the story of how Russia built an empire on Middle Eastern chaos. This is the documentation of a 50-year pattern now reaching its culmination. This is the money trail your history books never followed. October 1973. Egyptian and Syrian forces launched coordinated attacks against Israeli positions. The Yom Kippur War lasted 19 days. Its economic aftershocks lasted decades. Arab oil producers announced an embargo against nations supporting Israel. The United States topped that list. Within months, oil prices quadrupled from $3 per barrel to $12. American consumers waited in gas lines, stretching for blocks. The economic shock contributed to stagflation that plagued the U.S. economy throughout the 1970s. Soviet planners watched from Moscow with satisfaction. They barely concealed in internal communications. Declassified Foreign Trade Ministry archives reveal the scale of Soviet gains. Oil export revenues tripled during 1974. Hard currency reserves, desperately needed to purchase Western technology and grain, expanded beyond projections. The embargo that strangled Western economies fed the Soviet treasury. A Politburo memorandum dated November 1973 stated the strategic calculation with brutal clarity. Regional instability in petroleum-producing zones creates market conditions favorable to Soviet export interests. Sustained tension, short of general war, maximizes revenue potential while minimizing direct Soviet expenditure. The Soviets did not create the 1973 war. They armed the Arab coalition and encouraged the attack through diplomatic channels, but the fundamental grievances driving the conflict existed independently of Soviet manipulation. Moscow simply positioned itself to profit from inevitable violence. This positioning required infrastructure built over the previous decade. Soviet petroleum extraction expanded throughout the 1960s. The massive West Siberian oil fields came online just as global demand accelerated. Pipeline networks connected extraction sites to ports, capable of loading tankers bound for Western Europe. The Soviets invested in production capacity that would only prove profitable at higher price points. The 1973 crisis delivered those price points. Western Europe faced a choice. Arab producers had demonstrated willingness to weaponize oil supply. Diversification became a strategic necessity. Soviet crude offered an alternative source, one less vulnerable to Middle Eastern politics. West German imports of Soviet oil increased 40% between 1973 and 1976. French purchases followed similar trajectories. The détente era facilitated energy relationships that seemed economically rational to Western buyers and strategically invaluable to Soviet planners. The architecture of European energy dependence on Russia began construction during the Arab oil embargo. 50 years later, that architecture created the leverage Russia deployed when invading Ukraine. Money flowed in a second critical direction during this period. Arab petroleum revenues accumulated in quantities that strained the absorptive capacity of regional economies. These petrodollars required investment destinations. American and British banks became primary repositories. The recycling of Arab oil wealth through Western financial institutions became a structural feature of global finance. The Soviets observed this recycling with analytical interest. Petrodollar flows strengthened Western banking systems even as oil prices damaged Western industrial economies. The financial sector gained, the manufacturing sector lost. This distributional shift accelerated the financialization of Western economies that continues shaping class dynamics today. Soviet economists documented this transformation in internal analyses. They recognized that high oil prices created winners and losers within Western societies. Energy-intensive industries suffered, financial intermediaries prospered. The political coalitions supporting Western governments fractured along these economic fault lines. Moscow filed these observations for future reference. The 1973 crisis established the template Russia would follow through every subsequent Middle Eastern conflict. Position production capacity in advance. Maintain alternative supply relationships with energy-hungry buyers. Allow regional instability to restrict competitor output. Collect the premium that frightened markets willingly pay for available supply. The template required one additional element. Soviet and later Russian leadership needed to avoid direct involvement that would trigger Western retaliation. The profits flowed from positioning, not participation. Moscow would arm regional actors. Moscow would offer diplomatic support. Moscow would never commit forces in ways that invited Western military response. This restraint discipline separated successful application of the template from catastrophic overreach. September 1980. Iraqi forces invaded Iran. The war that followed lasted 8 years and killed over 1 million people. The destruction reshaped Middle Eastern politics for a generation. Soviet oil revenues during this period reached record levels. The Iran-Iraq War removed 2 major petroleum producers from reliable supply calculations. Iranian output collapsed under the strain of revolutionary chaos and military bombardment. Iraqi production facilities became priority targets for Iranian strikes. Combined output from both nations fell by over 4 million barrels per day at the conflict's peak. Global markets adjusted through price increases that doubled Soviet export earnings. The Reagan administration pursued a complex strategy during this period. Washington tilted toward Iraq, providing intelligence support and facilitating agricultural credits that freed Iraqi resources from military spending. The goal was preventing Iranian revolutionary expansion while maintaining the war. Its continuation prevented either regional power from achieving hegemony. Soviet strategy operated on a different axis entirely. Moscow supplied weapons to both combatants. Iraqi forces received Soviet tanks, aircraft, and artillery through deals worth billions. Iranian purchases, though smaller, maintained Moscow's relationship with Tehran, even as revolutionary rhetoric denounced both superpowers. The Soviets profited from arms sales, while the war they fueled elevated oil prices to levels that transformed their national accounts. Brezhnev-era economic planning documents reveal the centrality of energy revenues to Soviet stability during this period. Hard currency from oil and gas. Exports financed grain imports that prevented food shortages. Energy money purchased Western technology that Soviet industry failed to develop domestically. The Afghan war consumed resources that petroleum sales replenished. Without the Iran-Iraq war price premium, Soviet economic collapse would have arrived years earlier. This reality shaped how subsequent Russian leadership understood the relationship between Middle Eastern conflict and national survival. The war's conclusion in 1988 brought a peace of exhaustion. Both nations emerged devastated. Regional power balances shifted in ways that created conditions for the next crisis. August 1990. Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. Saddam Hussein, struggling to service debts accumulated during the Iran War, seized the small, oil-rich emirate in an operation lasting 2 days. Oil prices doubled within weeks of the invasion. The Soviet Union stood at the edge of dissolution during this period. The economic reforms of perestroika had generated chaos rather than growth. Nationalist movements in Baltic and Caucasian republics accelerated toward independence. The Communist Party's monopoly on power crumbled. Even in this terminal phase, elevated oil prices provided breathing room. Soviet export revenues during the Gulf crisis exceeded projections by 28%. The windfall arrived too late to reverse systemic collapse, but it financed the managed dissolution that prevented Yugoslavia-style violence across the Soviet space. Money flowed to regional elites whose cooperation ensured relatively peaceful transitions. The pattern held even as the state it enriched disappeared. Russia emerged from Soviet collapse as a diminished but still resource-rich successor. The petroleum infrastructure remained. The production capacity persisted. The strategic understanding of Middle Eastern instability as economic opportunity survived the ideological transformation from communist to capitalist governance. Yeltsin-era economic chaos nearly destroyed this inheritance. The 1990s brought asset stripping, oligarch accumulation, and production decline that halved Russian output from Soviet peaks. Western advisors prescribed shock therapy that concentrated wealth while immiserating populations. International Monetary Fund conditions demanded market liberalization that foreign interests exploited. Oil prices collapsed during this period, falling below $10 per barrel in 1998. The Russian economy cratered. Default and devaluation wiped out middle-class savings. Western observers declared Russia finished as a serious power. They underestimated the infrastructure that remained. March 2003, American and British forces invaded Iraq. The operation toppled Saddam Hussein within weeks. The occupation that followed lasted 8 years and cost over $2 trillion. Russia collected a different kind of dividend. Vladimir Putin had consolidated power by 2003. The oligarchs who had looted the 1990s economy faced a choice: accept subordination to the state or face prosecution. Most chose accommodation. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who resisted, found his Yukos oil company dismantled and its assets transferred to state-controlled Rosneft. Russian petroleum production recovered as state direction replaced oligarch chaos. Output climbed toward Soviet-era levels. Pipeline projects pushed through regulatory and financing obstacles. The infrastructure necessary to monetize the next Middle Eastern crisis took shape. The Iraq War delivered the crisis on schedule. Brent crude prices rose from $25 per barrel in 2002 to $147 per barrel in July 2008. The removal of my Iraqi production from stable supply calculations contributed to this increase. Insurgent attacks on Iraqi infrastructure prevented output recovery. Markets priced in the permanent instability American intervention had created. Russian government revenues expanded proportionally. The federal budget balanced at oil prices around $20 per barrel when Putin took office. By 2008, budget assumptions incorporated prices above $70. The difference funded a military reconstruction that returned Russian forces to operational effectiveness. It financed social spending that built Putin's domestic political coalition. It accumulated reserves that provided insulation against future Western pressure. The Kremlin studied American difficulties in Iraq with attention extending beyond military lessons. American strategic focus locked onto the Middle East for a decade. The Iraq occupation consumed military resources, diplomatic bandwidth, and political attention that might otherwise have countered Russian moves in the post-Soviet space. Moscow observed this consumption and identified opportunities. The 2008 Georgia War tested American distraction. Russian forces invaded Georgia in August 2008, responding to Georgian operations in the breakaway region of South Ossetia. The war lasted 5 days. American response remained rhetorical. The Bush administration, consumed by Iraq and the unfolding financial crisis, lacked capacity for effective intervention. Moscow noted the result and filed it alongside 1973 analyses. Middle Eastern conflict served Russian interests through 2 channels. The direct channel delivered elevated energy prices and expanded revenues. The indirect channel diverted American strategic attention and military resources from regions Moscow considered its sphere of influence. The Iraq War activated both channels simultaneously. American forces remained in Iraq as the financial crisis of 2008 reshaped global economics. The Federal Reserve's response to that crisis, quantitative easing that expanded the money supply, initiated currency dynamics that would later facilitate Russian sanctions evasion. The inflation that followed a decade later traced roots to monetary policies adopted during this period. Russia recovered from the 2008 financial shock faster than Western analysts predicted. The reserve funds accumulated during the oil boom provided cushion. State control over strategic sectors prevented the cascading bank failures that paralyzed Western economies. By 2010, Russian GDP growth had returned while Europe and America struggled with prolonged recession. This performance built confidence in Moscow that shaped subsequent risk calculations. The Crimea annexation of 2014 followed logically from lessons learned during the Iraq era. Western attention had shifted toward other concerns. European energy dependence on Russian supply created leverage against Syria sanctions. The military rebuilt during the oil boom years possessed capacity for rapid operations against unprepared opponents. Putin applied the template and succeeded. The sanctions that followed Crimea proved less severe than initial Western rhetoric suggested. European dependence on Russian gas limited enforcement enthusiasm. Workarounds emerged within months. The Russian economy adjusted and stabilized. The stage was set for larger gambles. February 2022. Russian forces invaded Ukraine across multiple axes. The largest land war in Europe since 1945 began with expectations of rapid Russian victory. Those expectations proved wrong. The economic predictions that accompanied them proved equally mistaken. Western leaders announced sanctions of unprecedented scope. Russian central bank reserves, held in Western institutions, faced freezing. Major Russian banks lost access to the SWIFT messaging system that facilitates international payments. Export controls targeted technology Russia needed for weapons production. An oil price cap aimed to reduce Russian revenues while maintaining global supply. These measures should have crippled the Russian economy within months. They did not. Bank for International Settlements data documents what happened instead. Russian oil export revenues remained substantial throughout 2022 and 2023. The price cap, set at $60 per barrel, applied to crude transported by Western-insured tankers. Russia responded by assembling a fleet that operated outside Western insurance and shipping networks. This shadow fleet now numbers over 600 vessels. The tankers are old, often purchased from Western companies eager to exit Russian business relationships. They carry minimal insurance from Western providers. They operate under flags of convenience registered in nations with limited enforcement capacity. They deliver Russian crude to buyers who value price discounts over compliance with Western sanctions. India emerged as the primary destination. Indian refineries processed Russian crude that Western markets refused. They refined this oil into products that entered global supply chains without Russian origin labels. The petroleum fueling vehicles across Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia often traces to Russian fields, laundered through Indian processing. The volume statistics reveal the sanctions failure. Russia exported more oil in 2023 than in 2021, the year before invasion. The discount that Indian and Chinese buyers demanded, roughly 30% below benchmark prices, still delivered revenues exceeding price cap targets. Profits accumulated despite the elaborate sanctions architecture Western governments constructed. How did this happen? The answer involves the very Middle Eastern dynamics this analysis tracks. Western diplomatic and enforcement capacity divided between Ukraine and the Middle East after October 2023. The Hamas attack on Israel and subsequent Gaza operations demanded American attention. Iranian involvement in regional tensions through proxy networks required response. Resources that might have tightened sanctions enforcement shifted toward crisis management. The Peterson Institute for International Economics identified this phenomenon as strategic attention deficit. Personnel who monitored sanctions compliance reassigned to Middle Eastern portfolios. Intelligence assets, tracking shadow fleet movements, redirected toward Iranian capabilities. Diplomatic bandwidth consumed by Israel-Hamas negotiations became unavailable for pressure on sanctions, evading intermediaries. Russia exploited every gap this attention shift created. OPEC Plus coordination provided additional cover. Russia joined the OPEC Plus production coordination framework in 2016. This arrangement linked Russian output decisions to those of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf producers. When prices fell, coordinated cuts supported revenue. When geopolitical tensions elevated prices, coordinated restraint maintained premiums. The Israel-Iran confrontation activated this mechanism. Each escalation in Middle Eastern tensions since October 2023 has corresponded with oil price increases that benefited all major producers, including Russia. The Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center documented these correlations in real-time analyses. Missile exchanges translated to revenue gains within days. Saudi Arabia has shown limited enthusiasm for undermining this arrangement. Despite American requests for production increases to pressure Russian revenues, OPEC Plus output decisions have maintained price support. Saudi national interests in elevated energy prices align more closely with Russian preferences than with American strategic objectives. This alignment persists regardless of rhetorical commitments to the Western security order. The payment mechanism transformation compounds these dynamics. When Russia faced dollar system exclusion through SWIFT removal, alternative payment channels already existed. China had developed the cross-border interbank payment system as a SWIFT alternative. India established rupee-ruble exchange mechanisms that bypassed dollar intermediation. These systems scaled rapidly under necessity's pressure. The Bank for International Settlements now tracks significant oil trade volume settled outside dollar channels. UN-denominated oil purchases from Russia to China exceed $100 billion annually. Rupee settlements through Indian intermediaries process comparable volumes. These transactions create precedents and infrastructure that additional nations now explore. 40 nations currently conduct some trade with Russia outside dollar systems. Each nation that joins this alternative network weakens the sanctions architecture further. Each successful transaction demonstrates that dollar exclusion carries survivable costs. Each precedent encourages additional defection from the dollar-denominated order. The petrodollar system built after 1973 erodes as you read these words. The pattern documented across 50 years now accelerates toward consequences that will reshape global finance. Consider what the evidence establishes. Russia has profited from every major Middle Eastern conflict since 1973 through elevated oil prices and diverted Western attention. This profit accumulation funded military reconstruction, reserve building, and strategic positioning that enabled the Ukraine invasion. Current Israel-Iran tensions continue activating the same mechanisms that produced these results. The system works. The system will continue working until its structural foundations change. Those foundations show no signs of changing. American strategic commitments in the Middle East remain extensive. The defense relationships, the security guarantees, the domestic political coalitions supporting Israel, the economic interests in Gulf stability, all persist. These commitments will continue demanding resources and attention when regional crises emerge. Russia will continue benefiting from each crisis. The alternative payment infrastructure now operational will continue expanding. Every transaction processed outside dollar channels builds institutional capacity and operational confidence. The nations participating in these alternatives face few meaningful consequences. Their number grows. Dollar hegemony declines incrementally with each transaction. The shadow fleet continues expanding and improving. Older vessels wear out, but replacements arrive. The insurance mechanisms, the shell company structures, the port relationships all become more sophisticated through practice. Enforcement faces escalating challenges. Russian oil reaches global markets regardless of Western preferences. OPEC plus coordination shows no indication of fracture. Saudi interests and Russian interests align on price maintenance. American requests for cooperation receive polite consideration and minimal action. The production restraint supporting prices continues. Revenue flows persist. The implications for Western populations crystallize around several realities. Energy prices will remain elevated and volatile as Middle Eastern tensions continue. The price you pay at the pump reflects geopolitical instability that shows no sign of resolution. Budget pressures from energy costs will constrain household spending and government fiscal space. Inflation pressures will persist as dollar alternatives expand. The currency dynamics supporting American purchasing power depended on global dollar demand for commodity settlement. As that demand fragments, the dollar's value faces structural pressure that monetary policy struggles to counter. Strategic competition will intensify as Russian resources accumulate. The revenues flowing through shadow fleet operations fund military production that extends the Ukraine war and positions forces for future operations. Western defense budgets will increase to match these capabilities. Social spending will face corresponding constraints. These outcomes emerge from structures built over decades. They will not reverse through individual policy adjustments or election cycles. The fundamental dynamic persists. Middle Eastern instability enriches Russia. American commitments guarantee continued instability. Russian profits fund capabilities that threaten Western interests. This is the petrodollar paradox in its mature form. The system that established American financial dominance after 1973 now generates the resources that competitors use to undermine that dominance. The security architecture protecting oil supplies creates the tensions that elevate prices, benefiting alternative suppliers. The sanctions designed to punish Russian aggression accelerate the payment system alternatives that reduce sanctions effectiveness. Every component of the system now works against its original purpose. Historical parallels offer limited comfort. The British Empire faced similar structural contradictions in its terminal phase. The costs of maintaining global position exceeded the benefits that position generated. Competitors exploited the gaps between commitments and capabilities. The architecture of dominance became the mechanism of decline. These processes took decades to unfold. They accelerated suddenly when critical thresholds crossed. We may approach similar thresholds now. The documentation assembled here establishes the pattern. The Soviet Foreign Trade Ministry records from 1973, the correlation studies tracking revenue increases through each conflict. The BIS settlement data, showing payment system fragmentation, the shadow fleet evidence demonstrating sanctions failure, all point toward a single conclusion. Russia understood something Western policymakers consistently miss. Power in the modern system flows through energy infrastructure and financial plumbing. Military force matters at margins, but the daily accumulation of resource revenues and the structural advantages of payment system control determine long-term outcomes. Control the bottlenecks. Position at the extraction points. Let others fight while you collect. This understanding guided Soviet strategy during the Cold War's final decades. It guides Russian strategy now. The current Israel-Iran confrontation represents another application of principles refined over 50 years. Russia did not create the tensions between Jerusalem and Tehran. The grievances driving that conflict exist independently of Russian manipulation. Moscow positions to profit from inevitable violence. The template holds. You now understand what your history classes never taught. The money trail your textbooks never followed leads through oil fields and pipeline routes, through shadow fleets and alternative payment networks, through 50 years of conflicts that enriched the same beneficiary. Russia wins when the Middle East burns. The burning continues.